One of the staples of my Sabbath routine involves my long run for the week. Now, you might think that odd to equate a long run with a Sabbath, especially those of us who, like one friend of mine once said, believe that running is for people who hate themselves. And you might think that even more if you actually saw some of my running routes, especially my long run routes. They often will head out of my house, down the street, and eventually catch a trail by a creek and then follow that trail all the way back to my house. Except right before the trail spits out into a park that kind of backs into my backyard, there's this kind of long and extremely steep hill to climb. And to give you just a visual of what this looks like, this is the elevation map of a recent 8-mile run. And you can see to the far right, that steep incline at the end, that's that hill at the very end of all of my longer runs, at least when it's warmer or nice enough out that you can catch the trail. Well, one of the interesting things, about halfway up this super steep hill at the end of my runs, there are these 2 pine trees that drop a whole bunch of pine needles in the middle of the path of the trail. And so while you're running up this final hill, gasping for air, you actually, for a kind of a moment, you catch this waft of pine scent. It just kind of comes out of the blue. And it's always there. It's part of the final experience of climbing this hill in these runs. And an interesting thing happened a few years ago where I hadn't been running for about 2 months. I'd been off with an injury and hadn't been able to run. And I was finally back outside, back on the trail. And I came down the trail and came up this final path and up this hill. And I caught that pine scent that I hadn't caught for some time. And catching that pine scent actually reminded me of how much I enjoyed going out for these runs and how thankful I was to be back running. Even though I was at a place in the run where I was breathing like Darth Vader, it just kind of caught me with this moment. And all I could do was kind of think through my mind or almost say through my gasping breath, this idea of I'm grateful. Wow, am I ever grateful? And ever since then, every time I run up that hill at the end of my runs and I run through these trees and I run over those pine needles and catch a whiff of that pine scent, the same thought is sparked, that thought of, wow, am I ever grateful? Wow, am I ever grateful to be out here enjoying the trail for a run? What's even more interesting is that since then, over the past few years, there have actually been a few other moments or markers in the course of especially my Sabbath day long run where I've experienced this dynamic and kind of almost unintentionally built this into my running routine. There's now the moment wherever I first catch the trail and I line up on the trail right beside this creek, beautiful views, and I'll remind myself, wow, am I ever grateful to be doing this? Or there's a bridge that I cross where down the creek you can see a waterfall and it's making this splashing noise and it looks beautiful. And I remind myself, wow, am I ever grateful to be doing this? The hill, just before the big massive hill at the end, crests over the creek and you get this panoramic with the sun beating down and shining off the creek. And it's just a beautiful view. And it reminds me again, wow, am I ever grateful? Past the pine needles at the end of my run, walking down the street or when I'm sitting on the porch, unlacing my shoes, I'll just take a breath and a moment to remind myself again, wow, am I ever grateful? And then when I sit in my backyard having my Gatorade or my G2, because it's half the sugar, again, the first sip will always kind of spark now this thought of, wow, am I ever grateful? And it's as if these moments have turned this longer run, especially my Sabbath longer run, into a bit more of almost a spiritual experience, because these moments allow me to experience glimpses of the beauty of the divine. It's almost got to that point without over spiritualizing. It's almost as if these moments have become God moments in the middle of my longer run in the course of my Sabbath day. And that's exactly what we want to talk about today in our final edition of this June series, is how in your Sabbath routine and the things that you do and enjoy, that you can capture some of these God moments as well. Because capturing these God moments in the course of our Sabbath can be the game-changing difference that gets us to the finish line of what this series ultimately intends. So far, if you've missed any weeks, we've been looking at what it takes to really experience rest and recreation to a greater degree this summer. And we've looked specifically at embracing the unforced rhythms of God's design of Sabbath. And to do that, to build in the structured stopping of doing what we regularly would do living at Mach 3 speed, and instead to incorporate routine resting into that Sabbath space, whether it's 24 hours or not, that Sabbath space that we've structured. And in addition to routine resting, we learned again last week, to build in some deliberate delight. Things that we most enjoy, things that bring us joy and happiness and real, true, deep enjoyment. Those are kind of the four ingredients that we've covered so far if we're going to experience rest and recreation this summer. But I don't know if you've been here for any other weeks. Maybe your host did it today. When we've been introducing these talks, we've introduced the series as Rest and Recreation or Rest and Recreation. And maybe you've thought that's odd and thought, why are you confused? You're the one who made up the title. Why are you debating the title for this? But it's actually this final week that moves us from just experiencing rest and recreation to actually being recreated by God when we make the kind of space within especially our Sabbath moments to capture these God moments where He begins to change us from the inside out. And that's what we want to consider today. Because on the one hand, similar to what I'm experiencing in these moments in my runs, capturing God moments has a way of anchoring your heart in God's grace. It has a way of anchoring your heart in God's grace. And when you can slow down and still yourself enough in these moments to capture the God moment, it can remind you that everything that really matters in life is ultimately a gift from Him that ultimately can change us. You look at one of the most popular verses, one of the most famous verses in the New Testament, the Bible. In Ephesians 2:8, it says this. It says, "It is by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." This is a famous verse because it most encapsulates the essence of the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And the downbeat is that the good news of Jesus is available to any of us, no matter who we are or what we've done, because it's not something we could ever earn or deserve. It's a gift from Jesus. It's a gift from God that is available to us by grace. And so in that regard, we are saved by grace. Oftentimes, though, people will interpret that to apply to our afterlife. Like, because we've trusted in Jesus, we are saved by grace, and we're saved from an eternity apart from God and saved to an entry into the pearly gates where Jesus is going to be waiting there with His arms open wide, or, some version of how you understand the afterlife. But I'm wondering if we can view this verse as much or maybe even more through our earthly life in the vision that Jesus had for His kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven, He described, and view the difference that grace can make in our lives on earth. Because when you're gripped by grace, when you understand that the things that most matter in life are actually a gift, something significant changes. Your drive changes. Your hustle changes. Your stress and anxiety and what you're about changes, because you understand that the most important things in life are not things that we can fundamentally earn or deserve. And what happens when your heart anchors in God's grace is that God begins to change our posture from a posture of desperately earning to deeply enjoying. And instead of desperately earning, our heart posture can embrace deeply enjoying the gifts that have been made available to us by God. It's one of the things that capturing these God moments can do. The other thing happens not in our hearts, it happens in our heads, where capturing God moments can also align our minds on God's vision. It can align our minds and kind of recenter us on God's vision and purpose for our lives. Take a look at what I mean in Romans chapter 12. The Apostle Paul says this in verse 2. He says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and pleasing and perfect will." So basically, the text says that when we make space to allow God to transform us by the renewing of our minds, our mind goes from conforming to the pattern of this world to embracing God's good and perfect will. Going from conforming to the pattern of this world to embracing God's good and perfect will. Well, let's consider the contrast of those for a second. Because if we think about the pattern of this world, what pattern of this world do we most conform to? Trying to buy into the North American dream, never being satisfied with what we have, always desperate for more, kind of in a Sidious, Altius, Fortius way, giving our all to trying to keep up with the Joneses in money and possessions and status and resume and all these kinds of things, and in that drive becoming exhausted and impatient and borderline or altogether burnt out. That's what we've been discussing in this series that has us crash landing into the summer. And yet, when you think about the contrast here of God's good, pleasing, and perfect will, what is that? From a God who is described in the scriptures as synonymous with love. And a Jesus who came to perfectly embody the nature of God and demonstrate and teach on that love. Who described a life with God, boiling it down to one greatest commandment, the two-dimensional love for God and people. Who demonstrated that perfect love on the cross, and not only demonstrated it, but rose again to empower that love so that people of faith could live out a faith that the New Testament describes as only counting when that faith expresses itself in love. Right? The pattern of this world is burnout and never satisfied and always working. The good and pleasing perfect will is love. And so what happens in these God moments when we make the space for them is not just a shift in our heart posture, but a shift in our minds that subtly but significantly shifts our purpose from striving for society's definition of success to instead savoring love. From striving for success to savoring love. Do you see the significance of trying to capture an increasing number of these moments during our Sabbath seasons, those periods of slowness and stillness that we can build in Sabbath? They anchor our heart in God's grace in a way that shifts our posture from desperately earning to deeply enjoying. And they align our minds with God's vision and his purpose for our lives, the life of love. And it shifts our purpose from striving for success to savoring love. That's the significance that can move us from just a life of rest and recreation, as if that isn't good enough, where we embrace the unforced rhythms of Sabbath, we engage in structured stopping and routine resting and deliberate delighting. And take it all the way to the finish line of capturing God moments in that slowness and stillness in order to have our hearts and minds changed where God can recreate us into the person he's always intended us to be. Now, as you reflect on that, you might be thinking, what do we need to restrict that to a Sabbath for? Why can't we do that anytime, any day? Why didn't we just begin with this at the very beginning of the series and kind of wrap up after 1 week? Well, what's the point of Sabbath? Why is that prerequisite to this? Well, in an ideal world, it wouldn't be. In an ideal world, we would be able to capture God moments moment by moment, every moment of every day, all day, every day, in a vision of life that Jesus describes as abiding in him. And as a result, we would be able to bear the grace-based, love-driven fruit that Jesus intends us and others to enjoy in life. What we've been talking about in this series, though, is that for many of us, life is not ideal. And we find ourselves crash landing into summer, borderline exhausted, for a reason, because life isn't ideal. And because it isn't ideal, what structured and embracing the rhythms of Sabbath can do is create the stillness and the slowness for us to capture these God moments. Because if you think about those dynamics of anchoring our heart and aligning our minds, anchoring and aligning takes slowness and stillness. Have you ever tried to anchor a boat while it's moving at full speed? That would be almost impossible. And if you could, it would be really dangerous. Or have you ever tried to align, like I thought about this, align a fly swatter around a fly while the fly is still buzzing around, right? You can only align once something's still. It requires slowness to anchor, stillness to align. This is why John Mark Comer describes the Sabbath this way in his book, Practicing the Way. He says, in ugly times, in busy, burnt out, overworked kinds of times, we need Sabbath to keep our hearts alive to the beauty of God and life with him in this world. It's through the slowness and the stillness of Sabbath that we can capture God moments, because as God says in Psalm 46:10, it's when we be still that we can know that he is God. Now in the church, I want us to appreciate that we actually have a word for the practice of capturing these kinds of God moments. We call that term worship. That's what worship is. It's slowing down and stilling our hearts and minds to capture God moments where God in that moment can recreate us a little bit, anchor our hearts in his grace and anchor our minds in his vision for a life of love. And that's the vision that God has for us in embracing a life of worship, which, as a bit of an aside, is one of the primary benefits of gathering in large group environments like this for what we call communal or corporate worship. Because even if we're not, fully invested in a Sabbath routine, by showing up and gathering and receiving the encouragement from and providing encouragement to each other, we can stimulate some of these God moments regardless of the week that we've had. And through songs that we sing and prayers that we pray and spiritual practices that we engage in and teaching content that we absorb, throughout the hour or hour and a half or so that we gather collectively, we can experience some of these God moments that allow God to recreate us. But the vision isn't just that we would gather in environments like this to experience these God moments of worship, but we would learn to, as John Mark Comer describes, practice the presence of God throughout our Sabbath, capturing more and more of these God moments so that they could then influence our non-Sabbath times, the rest of our week, and help drive a slower, stiller, more spiritually conscious rest of our week where we could get to enjoying and experiencing more of these God moments, moment by moment, day by day in our everyday. For starters, though, we want to focus on today and in your life and mine, what it would take for us to go all the way to the finish line in practicing rest and recreation so that we could get to rest and recreation. In what ways, as you begin to incorporate the practices of Sabbath, embracing its rhythms, structured stopping, routine resting, and deliberate delighting, could you get a consciousness to actually start seeing and appreciating the divine and soak in those God moments of worship where God can recreate you by anchoring your heart in his grace and anchoring your mind in his vision of love? Maybe you don't run up a hill at the end of your long run on your Sabbath and catch a whiff of pine needles that sparks that. But maybe there are things in your life that could spark that as you experience a slower, stiller Sabbath dynamic in your world. Maybe you're able this summer to get near some body of water, maybe in Lake Erie or, walking the pier in Port Dalhousie and St. Catharines towards Lake Ontario. Or maybe you're lucky enough to have a friend that invites you to their cottage one time. I wonder whether the sound of the splashing waves could be one of those slower, stiller moments that could spark worship in you. Or maybe if you don't have access to a cottage or a body of water, maybe just walking around your neighborhood and catching the aroma of freshly cut grass could spark the thought of worship in you. Or maybe if you don't even leave your house, maybe looking out your front window or your kitchen window and catching a sunrise in the morning or a sunset in the evening could spark just a moment of worship in you. Or maybe if you incorporate some of these Sabbath rhythms, maybe the taste of your favorite meal, or the smell of a cup of coffee, or seeing the boiling water come up from a cup of tea, or enjoying great conversation with a friend or family member could spark just a moment of worship in you. Or maybe when you convene in an environment like this, or maybe when you gather at Harvest Kitchen on Friday night or at a community barbecue at one of our locations, maybe being surrounded by people who so deeply love you could just spark a moment of worship in you. Are there ways where we could move slowly enough and be still enough that our consciousness could awaken to a moment of the divine where we could capture that God moment and experience a moment of worship where God could then recreate us in a way where we could be anchored in his grace and in a way where we could be aligned with his vision for a life of love? A pastor friend of mine once said, when it comes to a life of following Jesus, that's what it ultimately boils down to. The way that he described it is that life is a gift and love is the point. Life is a gift and love is the point. And the interesting thing is that Jesus himself actually instituted a spiritual practice for his followers that we're going to experience today as we wrap this service up that seeks to root us in those very same realities. It's called the Lord's Supper or communion. And in it resembles Jesus' final meal with his disciples, where he referred to two object lessons, two symbols. One was the bread that he described as symbolic of his body broken for us, representing the forgiveness that's available as a gift for us to receive. And then he used the cup of wine, or grape juice in our case, to represent what he called the new covenant in his blood. The new relationship we can have with him that's not based on the law, but is based on love. The bread represents the gift. The cup represents a life of love. And I wonder, as we participate in communion today, whether we've been observing Sabbath or not, whether we can slow down our hearts and minds and still our souls enough for those symbols as we taste them, as we ingest them, to actually trigger a moment of worship, where in that moment of worship, our hearts can be re-anchored, our minds can be realigned, and we can be recreated in that moment into the kind of person we've always wanted to be, that God intends us to be. So I'm going to invite the band up now at your location, and in just a moment, the worship leader will provide some more instructions for the logistics of how we can participate in this communion experience together. But for now, whether you've been observing Sabbath so far or not, let's slow our hearts. Let's still our minds. Let's take a breath and prepare to engage in this experience designed by Jesus in remembrance of him, appreciating the unideal world we live in when we forget him, in a way that allows us to reflect on his grace and his life of love symbolically, so that we can be recreated into embracing and savoring a life with him, where that life is a gift and love is the point. Let's pray together. Jesus, as we prepare to participate in communion together, I pray that you would slow our spirits, slow our hearts, still our minds, still our souls, and allow us through these symbols, through tasting, through eating and drinking these symbols, that we could have a moment with you, that we could remember you, that in this moment We could express gratitude, that we could be loved by you and love you back. And in this moment, you would recreate us just a little bit more to move us in your direction of grace and love. I pray that it would inspire us to incorporate more of these moments, not just in our Sabbath day, but from our Sabbath day to drive our everyday, so that more and more, moment by moment, every day, day by day, we can experience these kinds of moments by you and not just enjoy your vision of rest and recreation, but go all the way and experience the recreation into the kind of person you've always made us to be. Thanks for your faithfulness. Thanks for what we can celebrate and represent through this communion ceremony together. We pray in your name, Jesus, and love you. Amen.